Hello and welcome to BCM300 Game Experience Design. This week I'm joined by game designer Richard Hall.
Ew.
And we are going to be talking about game designers. I've been looking forward to having this chat for a while. We're going to keep it short. You've got a lot going on this week, so we just want to run through some prominent game designers and talk through some of their work and kind of help you develop a way of talking about designers and some of the things that you can look for. And this is really to serve as background for your own research, both in terms of the kinds of inspirations you can take from game designers and their work, and putting that into your own game design. Because as we've said many times in this subject, there is no intellectual property on game mechanics, and it's a really lovely industry in that designers are frequently saying, "Oh, I really like that mechanic in your game. I wonder if I can take that and make it do something different in my game, or can I make a different game out of this game mechanic, or this interaction between story world and mechanic."
Yeah. The reason to look at designers as well is just like with their original discussion of like competing models, is designers are all different people who let you contextualize work. So we're going to talk about some of the things that some of these designers do regularly, because that's the stuff that interests them as designers, and that's a really valid, worthwhile way to approach your own potential design work.
This is the tabletop game industry, because it's a niche creative industry. A lot of game designers get into the industry as a kind of second or third job. A lot of them come into it peripherally, with a passion or an idea or something that they want to work on. And then through playtesting, that becomes, a product. And then through either, crowdfunding or working with a publisher, it becomes a reality. And then there's a process of building up a record of successes and then turning that into a full-time career. That said, however, other people just jump into it, right?
Yeah.
So there are multiple pathways into this industry. So
what Chris said about second or third job, though, is it's really important to stress that, like, in the world at any given time, there probably aren't more than, say, 5 or 6 people who could very literally say, my entire job full time is game designer for board games. There's a lot of people with lots of interrelated stuff.
Yes, they might be doing consultation for other types of experiences. They might be working on multiple projects at a time. Like, you don't just work on one game and then publish that game. You're working on multiple publishers. You might have multiple roles. It's not an old school linear production chain.
Yeah, and similarly, you have blokes like I'm going to get this wrong, Jamie Stegmaier. I always mix up if it's Jamie or Jason. He definitely is a full-time game designer, but the thing is, part of what he's doing is also marketing his products, developing publisher connections, working with manufacturers. There is a whole web of interconnected, basically full-time job level stuff that he's doing in addition to making the board games. So it's very, very rare that you'd ever find anyone who like turns up at work, designs the game for an hour, and then goes home.
It's funny that you mentioned Jamie Stegmaier, who created Stonemaier Games, because he's not in these slides. He's actually one of my favorite game designers. But we're gonna put him into the week on crowdfunding.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've got the first screen up, and I wanted to kind of use this idea of connecting to Eurogames and Amerigames in terms of game designers, because there is this kind of common trope or kind of thinking that Eurogames are very much about the single designer who has a vision about what the players experience should be.
Yeah.
While in America, because of the different corporate studio structure of games publishers, and this is also true of the UK as well, and of companies that have particular, wargaming tabletop histories that
Yep.
Amerigames tend to be designed by large groups, 3, 4, 5. Now, these are just rules of thumb. These are just observations about trends. There are lots of Eurogames designed by 2 or 3 people, and there are lots of Amerigames who have single designers, but that's true. Yep. But I wanted to kind of put this together because, what we haven't talked about so far in the subject is games designers outside of the Euro-Western centric domain. We've talked about Asian games in terms of classic games, but we haven't yet really kind of addressed Asian games as a kind, because there doesn't really exist in the contemporary space a kind of thematic industry summary for Asian games.
Yeah, there's no short, easily handed around meme about Asian games and Asian game development, which is a maddening, because if you actually look at games from Japan, I could froth about that from days. Same thing with China, same thing with Indonesia, but I don't have a lot of names that I can attach to that. Part of that is a cultural barrier. Part of it is a lot of developers in Asia just aren't showing up on the YouTube channels and podcasts and conventions that I pay attention to as someone who does not speak their languages. But even as someone in this space, the number of people from Asia who are doing Asian game design, as opposed to the people from what we would ham-fistedly refer to as the West, the English-speaking world, there are also Asian developers in that space, and they are also made more rare. It's really, really unfortunate. And it plays into our colonialism problem and our regionalism problem and all that stuff, which I will not go in on here because I'm sure I'm going to go in another class.
I mean, this is an interesting area of research that you and I have been talking about and have been looking at a little. I've got on screen Senfung Lim, and he is a Korean designer now, and I think it's really interesting that he designed with Jesse Wright The Legend of Korra, the pro bending arena game, because this really kind of throws into real contrast this idea of what an Asian text is, because Korra, which is of course the
pan-cultural fusional kung fu anime of sorts.
People might not know Legend of Korra. It's the sequel to Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was very much, as Richard says, a pan-cultural product, in that it was American showrunners producing anime in the West that was largely created, drawn and animated in Korea.
Yeah, with experienced animation house developers. To call it not anime would be to dismiss the work of people who work on a bunch of anime.
Well, I mean, this is another subject that we do, and it's called BCM300 Digital Asia. If you're interested, where we talk about this stuff.
That's a great subject. You should definitely check that out, students.
But even within Avatar, there's a pan-cultural influence of the different types of martial arts. Anyway, we're getting off topic. What I want to point out is that this is a really interesting game that tries to recreate a visual experience in that text. He also made Junk Art.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to track this game down for class because it's a dexterity game. And
I've played Junk Art at cons, and I've played the outsized con game of Junk Art, which is like every object is about the size of your fist.
That's awesome.
It's really good.
One of the things we don't have a lot in our classroom games is dexterity games, and this is something I want to fix in the future.
It's like Jenga and Rhino Hero, and then we kind of just trail off.
Yeah, you brought in Rhino Hero, and that's a great game. That's a really great dexterity game. But there's lots of different stacking games and moving games. I don't think you can call Throw Burrito a dexterity game.
Yeah, it's a cousin of the space, though. It is definitely one that uses tangible physical space, and that's the thing with Junk Art. Junk Art is tangible physical object interacting, and that's the thing about board games that deserves a whole bunch of mention. Like Junk art is able to make the actual material of the objects you're working with a part of the game.
What's also nice about junk art is that it's really an abstract game because it's, balancing shapes. And yet it has this lovely kind of idea of art and the found object and the kind of aesthetics of this, weird conglomeration of material objects. Really, really nice game.
Yeah, excellent work.
The game that we do have in class is Christopher Chung's Lanterns.
Yes.
Lanterns, the Harvest Festival, is playing on the Chinese Lantern Festival. It's a very beautiful, very vibrant, high contrast tile laying game. And I was looking on Board Game Geek, and Christopher Chung hasn't developed that many games. He's only got
he's not a very prolific designer.
But this game is actually really successful. There's a beautiful app version on iOS and Android.
And therein you have this problem of like the full-time game designer, and that Chris Chung is absolutely a game designer. But the bulk of the work he does now is consulting and working with other people because there's just only so much work to go around in the field.
But that's like many of the creative industries. It's largely a gig economy, or at least a contract economy, and you're constantly kind of working on a contract, finishing a contract, starting a new contract, looking to find other contracts. What I want to point out about Lanterns is that it is very Asian themed.
Yes. Which is one of those things that comes up when we talk about, like, we will make fun of this from time to time. Chris and I especially, me more so than Chris, because Chris is nicer than I am. But a thing I will often make fun of is the fact that there is a giant bulk of Asian-themed games in the board game collections we have. And overwhelmingly, you will find that not only were they not designed by Asian people, but they were designed by one guy.
Yes.
Named Antoine Balza, who's Dutch.
So there's a lot of interesting overlap between modes of production, between the cultures from which game designers originate, and drawing on the different personal and cultural influences to make experiences for players.
Yeah. In fact, Chris Chung has talked about this with, not to get all name droppy, but I did an extensive talk about Orientalism in board games on Twitter recently, when, believe it or not, a movie star asked me to.
Which one?
And have you ever seen Crazy Rich Asians?
Yes.
The actor who plays PT.
Right.
He is a board game reviewer.
Ah.
His name is Calvin Wong. He works for the Ding and Deck podcast.
Yes.
He's great.
Yes.
Anyway,
I think I follow him.
Yeah, but this Chris Chung said, like, when he started out originally, Lanterns was going to be a game about flower arranging in a very Western way, and the developers said, "Can you do something that expresses something you actually care about more?" And he was like, "Oh, okay." And we got Lanterns out of it, and Lanterns is great.
There's another kind of Asian themed flower game called Lotus, which is a trick taking game. I'm going to move on now to Eric M. Lang.
And that game's Dutch too. Anyway,
yes, this is interesting. This is how culture works, right? Culture flows across boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
And culture can be a theme, and it can be a really interesting theme. And there's nothing wrong, essentially, with someone making a game experience about a culture that isn't their own, because that can be done from love, that can be done from interest, that can be done from passion and respect. Go on.
I mean, the reason I harp on this isn't because it's bad for non-Asians to make games about Asia. I would be an absolute hypocrite if I said that, because I have made a card game which is about an Asian-inspired culture. The reason I bring it up is also to put it in context alongside the small number of English-speaking Asian developers who have been pushed out of this industry because, in a part, we aren't listening to them about stuff that they can bring to the table.
Yes, I take your point there.
It's a simplified version of the point, but I don't want to get into cultural appropriation versus cultural fusion right now.
This is something that maybe we can take up in the Friday class, actually, and online, and talk a little bit about that. because I actually think cultural appropriation is a really important part of the way in which culture is produced, and Eric Lang is a great example of that. So Eric is a Black Canadian game designer who created Rising Sun. Rising
and a
Sun,
bunch of stuff.
I've got his games on screen, but I want to talk about Rising Sun because that is very much a fantasy themed game that draws on Japanese culture. Yeah. And there's an interesting story about that with regards to Wikipedia. Do you want to tell that one?
So the long and short of it is that Rising Sun was a Kickstarter game, big miniatures game, big, bright, colorful theme, great artistic direction, really looks very good. And they had an onboard, an amazing designer who makes great games, who everyone knew had a lot of presence to him. But the research for the narrative department was not exactly great. There was there was a set of stretch goals where they would add various different classic Asian monsters to the game's miniatures lineup. And when those goals were met and the miniatures were produced, this led to one reviewer, who I believe was Japanese American, going, I've never heard of this monster. That's weird. And looking it up, finding the only reference to it on that existed was on Wikipedia. And it was a prank entry on a list of categories where it was actually the name of a New Zealand sheep farmer whose mates had pranked him by putting him on a list of Japanese monsters. Like that's one of those real embarrassing, this is how little of your work you've got to show off.
I mean, you can read it as a kind of cultural ignorance. I don't read it that way. I read it as the lovely sense of humor of the internet and the way in which knowledge and information occurs via the internet. And it's a kind of constant reminder that you always need to verify your sources from at least two different well-credited sources. So it's a kind of cute, endearing, harmless approach. But it's an important reminder, right? If you're going to be creating a game experience that is drawing very clearly on a specific culture, you need to be able to do your research. And the best way to do that is to consult with people who live that culture. And particularly getting artists from that culture, or your playtesters from that culture. There's
a similar thing with the L5R card game where they got a whole bunch of American artists. I don't know if this is the most recent division, but there was a fuss where they got a whole bunch of different artists from America to make art of these Asian themed characters wearing traditional armor and gear. And because the artists, out of just ignorance, didn't know exactly how these items went on, there were all these items that were layered. There were all these clothing items that were layered wrong. And so if you actually tried to put those clothes on, you literally couldn't because they wouldn't fit in that particular way. And these are just things where talk to the people who know what they're talking about.
This happens in all of what we call the creative industries or the cultural industries, where you get, in drama, in historical realism, there's all these sorts of inaccuracies, but we try to do our best to make sure that they don't exist, because otherwise, I'm friends with
a robotics engineer who does civil engineering for work. And do you want to know how many times we will watch a fantasy movie or see art from a video game, and he'll point at a bridge and go, "That wouldn't work."
Yes, exactly. Now, but this is the point about fantasy, right? How much do you suspend your disbelief? How much realism do you want in your fantasy? For example, I'm quite a big fan of the Age of Sigmar, which was described as if Lord of the Rings is realism's fantasy, Age of Sigmar is fantasy's fantasy.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm going to move on now because I want to talk about
just one final point on Eric Lang. Eric Lang is another example of those consulting developers. Eric Lang has hundreds of game credits at this point. Well, actually probably not hundreds, but easily 100 game credits because games are in development and they will say, we need someone to work on the systems. Hey, Eric Lang, do you have an engine for us? Now, this can lead to a problem where some of the games he's designed don't have necessarily the great connection between flavor and mechanics, but they're all solid and they all work. So that's another kind of job you wind up with in this industry.
Yeah. You'll notice in this list that he's worked with Anton Balzer. So that
yeah.
that's a nice...
And the last check was Sen Fung Lim.
Yes. I want to move on now and just spend a little bit of time, but before we get into some of the kind of super big names in the industry, I want to highlight some of the women that work in the industry, because there is a lot of white dudes who work in this industry, both from Europe and the US. And it's not that women haven't been making games. It's often that they just for whatever reason, don't have the enormous back catalog of huge games. But there are some beautiful games out there designed by some really cool women. And have you ever played Quirkle?
I played it once at an event, which was getting to playtest all the Spiel des Jahres games of that year.
So Susan McKinley Ross created Quirkle, and it's a super fun little mix and match game that is perfect for kids age. I mean, it says 6 and up, but I'd say 5 to 8 is really the real window there for Quirkle. It's a bit like what's the classic game? Dominoes.
Yeah, it's got a bit of Dominoes to it. It's got a bit of your Connect 4.
Yes, even the box reminds me of Connect 4. I think there's a little bit deliberate brand visual aesthetic association going on there that's quite clever. And Quirkle is available in many different formats. There's Quirkle cards. I think there is like a Quirkle Connect 4 thing as well.
Yeah. So
this is a really interesting example of how one game design has been produced across multiple different game-related products. Differentiation with one single kind of vision for a game experience. And, importantly, this is an abstract game, right? The theme is matching, I guess, rather than having a kind of narrative or story element to it. Similarly, moving on, and I think to another Spiel winner is Angelika Falsors and Peter Haluska. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Flower Power.
Yeah.
I don't have a copy of this. I played this at a con with my kids. It's got a lovely wooden peg board system where you roll the dice and you put these beautiful cellophane discs over your flowers.
Yeah.
Super clever. I haven't seen many games that play with this kind of transparent mechanic. There are, of course, Gloom and
there absolutely are games that do it, but the nature is that it's not as common, and that's one of the things that makes these things interesting. The weird contradiction that lives in the heart of board games is everything's been tried a bit before, but we don't really have the best version of anything. So yeah, I can point to Gloom and say, well, Gloom does what Flower Power does, but does it really? Does 7 Up do the same thing? No, not really.
No, but they're experimenting in different ways with transparency as a material.
So cool.
Connected to a mechanic.
Yeah.
It's lovely. And this is the kind of thing that, we want to encourage you to do in your game design, right? In class and in your groups, is to look at what these awesome developers designers are doing and go, okay, how can I use that cellophane? How can I use that transparency to make an interesting experience for players? What could I do with that?
In this particular time of lockdown and quarantine, think about the stuff you've got in your life, in your house that you use that other people don't use, and think, what can I use this for in a game?
Yeah, I did used to do an in-class exercise where I would just give people random objects from around the house and make them develop a game based on that. Let's move on to talk about another product that has hundreds of iterations, and that is Flux, co-designed by Kristen Looney. Flux is a really, really clever card game. Flux is a deck of cards, and on each card there is a rule, and as you play the cards, the rules for the game change. It takes what does and pushes
kind
it.
of ramps it through the roof.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I mean, if you like and you like the kind of strategic play of that I think is even really the success of what's the cat's Exploding Kittens.
Yep. Same fundamental engine, yeah.
Yeah, and you can have a look at this link in the Prezi to the Flux entry in Board Game Geek, and there is Flux Cthulhu, Flux Star Trek, Flux King Kong, Flux Simpsons, Flux like it just goes on and on and on. There are just so many iterations.
There really is no end to what Flux can be used for.
So here's a great example of a designer who just made one game, made such a good game that they can now just keep making that game.
Yep.
Once a year with whatever product and do really well. And
like that, you sometimes hear this called one-hit wonders, like how in music you have people who made one-hit song and that's it. But the thing is, in board games, one hit's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Like Scrabble is a one-hit wonder. The guy who made Scrabble, Alfred Mosher Butts.
Sure.
It's the only successful game he had.
I don't think Flux is like that. It's almost like coming up with a whole genre or.
If someone said my favorite genre of card games is Flux, I would not blink at that. That does not sound to me.
Yeah, absolutely. What other games have this kind of high level of iteration? So Codenames
and Pandemic are the only two that spring to mind.
Pandemic is another good example of where there is just endless reiteration on the same theme with different settings and different worlds. And this is the lovely thing, is that you can come up with a theme and you can come up with a set of mechanics, and then you can come up with and then you can, mix and match those things, right? You can take that theme out and try it with a whole different set of mechanics.
Yep.
And see
indeed, you can also look to The Walking Dead, specifically The Walking Dead as a franchise. They have made so many different other games as Walking Dead variants, so you can take them in the other direction as well.
Game of Thrones, there are just so many Game of Thrones games out there. I'm going to move.
Some of them are really good.
I want to.
That sounded really sarky.
No, it did.
Some of them are really good though.
Yeah, they are. Some of them less successful, but that's the nature of the market. I want to spend a few minutes just talking about Elizabeth Hargrave and her game Wingspan. Now, we mentioned Jamie Stegmaier at the start and his company Stonemaier Games. They are the publishers for Wingspan, which is designed by Elizabeth Hargrave. This is definitely in my top 10 of tabletop game experiences. This is a game that is about collecting sets of birds. At the moment, the base set is North American birds. There's just been an expansion pack for European birds, and I cannot wait for the Australian bird.
Yeah, at last check, there's going to be an ANZ version.
Australia and New Zealand.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, what's notable about Elizabeth Hargrave? Okay, first things first, I guess, to just give you a little bit of historical context. Wingspan was so popular, and it sold out so fast for about a month there. Mm-hmm. You couldn't buy it at retail. And of course, when you can't buy things at retail, what do nerds do? We react extremely poorly. So there were copies of Wingspan being sold, not being offered, but being sold on eBay for $4,000. Yep. I saw it being listed for 10. I didn't see it ever selling for 10.
Yep.
But this game was so good. And the thing is, the people who bought it thereafter didn't go, oh, this is a waste of my time and my money, I'm mad. No, there were people going, yeah, no, that was worth it. Like, Wingspan is a fantastic game.
I've bought this game, I think I'm up to 3 times now. I bought it for myself. I bought it for my mom. I bought it for a friend as a present. Like, it's just such a good game. It's very Euro. You are doing your own thing. And there are some interactions, and it's a little bit like Flux in that every time you play a bird, it has a rule and it affects the game going forward. It has a really high materiality. It has this lovely, cardboard dice roller. It has these beautiful plastic eggs that you collect. You can buy upgrades to this via meeples.com. You can get wooden birds to go with it. So there's a huge range of paratexts in the marketplace.
And not only, but also when it comes to this game, and this is not just like Wingspan is an amazing game and Elizabeth Hargraves made it. She won a different Game of the Year award for a different game in the same year. She released via Button Shy Games a game called Tussie Mussy.
Yeah.
Tussie Mussy is print and play. You can go and get it on the PNP Arcade that we've linked to you to repeatedly. And it is $1. And that game won a Best of Print and Play of the Year award for being just such an excellent, tight design. And that uses 18 cards.
I need to add that to this slide. Yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth Hargraves is not this isn't a matter of with Flux, and I'm not saying this to rubbish on Flux, but it is not a matter of she designed a game and then iterated on it. No, she's just really, really good as a designer, and she has been advocating for constantly including more people in the game design space, because right now it's a little bit of a white guy fest. Not entirely,
we'll get into that, but the main thing is that the industry is going through a boom phase.
Yeah,
and where it was a quite lockdown industry, now it is because of crowdfunding and Kickstarter and a whole range of reasons to do with printing becoming cheaper and distribution becoming cheaper and more content. The tabletop games industry is taking off. I do want to point out the lovely artists, Anna Maria Martinez, Natalia Rojas, and Beth Sobel, who I follow on Instagram, all three, because they have such beautiful pencil artwork for all of these birds, and you can get a preview of what's coming up. So just a beautiful design team. All around.
And Beth Sobel's work in particular, she's done work on. Well, she did illustration for Lanterns, which has already come up.
Yeah. Just beautiful work. I just a quick nod to Suzanne Goldberg, who's one of the designers of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, because this is a totally underestimated game. Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, we talked a little bit about before. You're basically reading newspapers from the 19th century and trying to figure out crimes and put maps together. It's just clues. It's the nerd Sherlock Holmes fan nerd game.
And the primary component that goes into that game is nothing but printed paper and writing.
Yeah.
You will absolutely have the capacity to make a game like that if you want to try.
And you can play it solo. In fact, it's probably best played solo. It's a really great game. All right.
It's an interesting thing in that we could and remind me to talk about this in the lecture, but solo games becoming multiplayer games, other players can often become unconsciously impediments, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, you're right. Let's do a super quick run through some of the biggest names in the tabletop game industry.
Yep.
We'll
try and do this quick.
We'll do this quick.
Honest, we're going to try.
Yui Rosenberg.
Yes.
Now, I started with him because a lot of students actually come in with a bit of knowledge about Bonanza. Bonanza was one of those games that kind of did well in Australia in the late 1990s and 2000s. So you might have grown up playing this game that is about collecting beans.
Mm-hmm.
He also made my wife's favorite game, Agricola, which is a super Euro game.
Le Havre, which is one of Tom Vassal's favorite games.
Feast for Odin, which is
one of Paul Dean's favorite games.
It's super, super interesting. These are massive Euro games. They're all about economies. They're all about making the best choices in your game. They have beautiful production. That high Euro of of art and cards and wooden meeple-like pieces.
And if you look at his stuff of late, it's also been unified by an interest in locking together little tiles in specific shapes. I believe we call them pentaminos.
Yes.
Or tetraminos.
Yeah.
Yeah. if you've seen a game with like trying to get little laying shapes in like little Tetris pieces to lay together, odds are good Uwe Rosenberg has had something to do with that.
So if you're trying to maybe design out of the roll and move space that you're in, or if you're trying to think about accessing different types of experiences for your players, for your group game, for example, definitely check out Yui Rosenberg's link on Board Game Geek. Have a look at the games that he's making and have a look at the mechanics in those games. There's so much there that you can draw on. All right.
Yep.
Let's move on to Quarry Knizia.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of his work. Quarry was the former lead designer for Fantasy Flight games. I have a lot of his games, particularly Eldritch Horror, and you can see behind me, I have a lot of the Star Wars X-Wing miniatures games. I've flown a lot of Star Wars ships around tables thanks to Quarry and his approach to game design.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's responsible for Battlestar Galactica, right?
Yeah.
Battlestar
Galactica,
which is one of those games that absolutely comes up every time we discuss big board games.
Battlestar Galactica is probably one of the best instances of a tabletop game adaptation of a screen product.
Absolutely.
It for some dark magical reason, they managed to encapsulate that version of Battlestar Galactica in a tabletop game really effectively.
It used to be the canard before Battlestar Galactica. The canard was you can't make a good board game out of another tie-in. Like the notion was all tie-ins are bad.
Yep.
And then Battlestar Galactica came along, and we all had to go, "Oh, okay, we were just doing it wrong."
And the same goes for his work on all the Star Wars games.
Yep.
He manages to capture in the mechanics, particularly, a feeling that is connected to watching those movies. That's why I fell in love with X-Wing, because even though you're just moving plastic pieces around on a flat tabletop, the mechanics with the cards and the maneuvers and the dials and the dice, it manages to sell you affectively on the idea of space battles in Star Wars.
I have heard the remarkable notion that his work is that his design for X-Wing treats movement as currency, which is a fascinating idea.
Super clever. And also his work on Eldritch Horror, right? It is that, you feel like at points in that game, it's like you feel like an investigator going a bit mad, trying to stop demons.
Great work.
Moving on to Rainer Knizia.
Here we go.
Do you want to talk about Rainer?
I will try and be brief, because to give you a summary of Rainer Knizia's games would be absolutely fruitless. We would take all the time we have for this podcast and then some. Rainer Knizia is a bloke who in the late 80s was a banker, decided he was sick of being a banker and decided to quit his job at the bank and move straight into making board games. And he has not stopped since. Rainer Knizia has, depending upon how you grade these things, over 1,000 game credits to his name, and is and like some estimates put it at like 4,000. He is a fantastically prolific guy. He is a systems designer. He is the bloke that they call in and say, all right, we need a system for this kind of game, and he'll go like, well, okay, so how about this? There is no way to encapsulate the types of games he makes, because he just makes lots and lots of very mathy games all over the place. Rainer Knizia has come up in the class before. I believe I mentioned him with my specific example of when designing a game, you can start with a mechanic, a theme, or a component. That's very much how he thinks. He thinks of games as collections of these disconnected elements, and then you work to connect them. Not
every game that he makes does an excellent job of connecting theme and mechanics. Although I'd say
he gets criticized infamously for having what they refer to as a painted on theme. Lots of his games are like that because the guy doesn't care that much about theme.
Yes, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think it's possibly that mechanics, his his very technical approach
Oh.
to game design, it really promotes that Euro style. And so theme can somewhat seem secondary, but there are some very clever relationships between theme and mechanics in some of his games. And I'm thinking particularly of Blue Moon.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lovely kind of ephemeral feeling to the mechanics in that game that match the thematic elements. So sometimes he really shines in bringing those two elements together. Other times, you are right. It's just a slap of paint on top of an abstract game system.
If you did want to look into Reiner Knizia's games and have like a serious opinion about it, go check out Tigris and Euphrates.
Yeah,
it's very well regarded. It's very well reviewed. You can find lots to talk about on YouTube.
Tigris and Euphrates is a great game. I want to move on to Christian T Peterson because his story is quite interesting. He came up with one of the most kind of prominent Ameritrash games, or where the idea of Ameritrash came from, which was Twilight Imperium in 1997, which is now into its fifth edition.
I think it's
fourth, right? It just keeps getting reprinted. It's a huge game.
Well, no, they make a point. It's printing and it's edition. You will not get a new edition of Twilight Imperium is new rules.
Very well said. Yes, thank you.
And at this point, they are currently grappling with printers saying, "No, we cannot make a box any bigger," and that's their current limit.
The thing I want to point out about Christian is that Twilight Imperium was so successful in an era when board games weren't the massive sellers that they are now, that he was able to start his own company, his own games publishing company, very similar to what Jamie Stegmaier has done, and we'll talk more about that next week. But Fantasy Flight Games, it started out as a European comic distributor, and then it acquired the license to publish the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu. They eventually got the rights to Game of Thrones, Star Wars, other Lovecraft games. What else have they done? Oh, of course, Games Workshop. They famously got the rights to publish games, tabletop games, for another games tabletop publishing company. That's genius.
Absolutely preposterous, the idea that it happened, but it happened, and they did it. And the games are also good, which is wild.
Also, a connection here to World of Warcraft, the board game, which was designed with Eric Lang.
Hi, Eric.
I have successfully only played World of Warcraft, the board game, once. It took all week.
Yep.
It took all weekend. It is such a faithful slave to the video game idea. That you literally have to take a character through the levels and then do a raid boss, and it just didn't work. But it's got such lovely components. I've used them in other games.
and that, by the way, is another example of Eric Lang's style of design, where he got brought in on contract to do the thing, and he did. They were like, "We want a game system." He's like, "Cool, dude. Here." And they were like, I believe he actually has remarked that the game was never going to be fun the way that he'd been given parameters.
Yeah,
but that's not what he was hired for. He was hired to make the system work.
Exactly, and it did work.
It does what it does.
Yeah, and the miniatures are great. So you can see here that there are these interesting interconnections between the leaders of the industry, and that brings us to one of the giants of tabletop game experiences, the mighty Richard Garfield.
Yeah,
Richard Garfield is a mathematician, and I think that says a lot. You might have heard of the little game that he created called Magic the Gathering, a collectible card game which was first published in 1993, which makes me feel exceptionally old. Magic, as you might know, is a collectible card game. So you buy packs of cards, you can buy sets of cards, but you also buy these boosters of cards that have, a rare, an uncommon, and a bunch of commons, and then
the usual distribution is 1 rare, 3 uncommons, and 11 commons, and an advertising card now.
Yeah, so He's also the designer of one of my favorite games, both the original and the remake, Netrunner.
Yep.
And I actually quite like his version.
Recently,
yeah, go on.
He made a game called Bunny Kingdom.
Bunny Kingdom's really cute. We've got to get a copy
really
of that.
is quite good if you like math, as might befit a math professor.
Yep. He also made a great game in the 90s called Robo Rally, which was about the most effective way to run a conveyor belt system for producing robots.
Yep. And it's an example of a programmatic game.
King of New York. King of Tokyo was the first one back in 2011. Kaiju fighting game with giant, big, chunky dice that is just the best way of getting, 8 to 12-year-olds into playing other types of board games experiences. If you
also recently both Artifact and Keyforge, I think it is.
Of course he did Keyforge. Of course.
Yeah, of course.
The
nature of these designers and developers, and we talk about, look at what these people are like, what they bring to the table. Richard Garfield doesn't make tons and tons of games. He's not like Reiner.
No.
But almost every game he's made has in some way slapped.
He's also got a very tight, even though he is a mathematician, he has a very tight connection between theme and mechanics. So his games have a lot of story. A game of Magic definitely has 3 acts. It's very clear, particularly when you're watching competitive Magic. There's this amazing story.
3-act structure to describe mathematic. He's used it to describe learning math. So this is he's absolutely in that mental space you're talking about.
He also has a very clear sense of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I think Reiner is clever, and some of his games are very clever, but they're not always what I would call fun. Whereas to date, I've not sat down and played a Richard Garfield game that I didn't think was fun.
Yeah.
The
main thing stopping me from getting into more of his games is I just don't have the time.
Oh yeah.
Every game he has, it's like a short lifetime investment. I got into Magic. That's all I got the time for. I'm sorry.
He does. I mean, King of Tokyo is very casual.
Yeah, good point.
But most of his games require a big investment.
I have King of Tokyo, and I even bought expansions, and I bought the upgrade kit because I wanted it all to look nice in the box.
Nice. So we're going to finish up there because we're already pushing on 50 minutes.
Oh geez, we're terrible at this.
We have absolutely skimmed the very surface of game designers. We haven't gone into Steve Jackson and his amazing history. We haven't gone into all the big prominent designers who have worked on RPGs like D&D.
Yeah.
Because we talk about that elsewhere.
And the stories around Dungeons and Dragons feature legal battles and bribery and collusion and murders, suicides, and there is just we've not talked about the underbelly of the industry. It's mainly been about some names to throw out at you to go and have a look on Board Game Geek and see what their body of work is and see how it might help inspire you in your own game design experience. So I think we're done there. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. And I hope this is helpful to the students.
I think
so. And not just, heaps of fun for me.
I think it's been a good one. We'll see you in class. We'll talk to you this week, and we'll come back next week to talk about crowdfunding.
All right. Awesome. All right.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Remember, play more games. See ya.